Ahoj všichni, rád bych vám ukázal záznam z mezinárodní soutěže v debatování, které se odehrávalo v Praze. Dneska se bude debatovat na téma Operace Anthropoid, kvůli které umřel Heydrich během druhé světové války, je morálně nelegitimní. Debata se odehrává v angličtině a zároveň se řídí velmi přísnými pravidly, které se jmenují British Parliamentary Debate. Pokud by vás zajímalo, jak takovýhle typ debaty funguje a pokud byste si sami chtěli naučit debatovat a rozcvičit se v soutěžní retorice, tak se můžete přihlásit na náš debatní klub v popisku tohoto videa. Doufám, že si video užijete, mějte se krásně, čau.
Panel. I think the core question that this motion imposes onto us is, what is even morality? And I think we're just going to define it the easiest way possible, which is morality is broadly doing the good thing. Obviously, this is like subjective to the person, but I think like Op would likely agree with us and probably say themselves that saving lives is good. However, what we're going to explain to you from OG firstly is that you can never weigh up different lives against each other, and therefore utilitarian metric fundamentally should not be used in this debate. But also secondly, even if you could do that, you cannot predict the outcome that you're going to get here. Well, you can predict the outcome to a degree that you're going to get here, which means that you actually actively doom people and therefore indirectly are actually responsible for their death, which means that is then on the flip side inherently morally illegitimate. So basically, 4 things in this speech. Firstly, why you can't weigh up lives against each other. Secondly, why you can predict that people will die as cause of this. Thirdly, why these people have never consented into sacrificing themselves for Heydrich to be killed. And fourthly, if I have time, otherwise through Dino, what the outcome of this in the grand total will look like. Firstly then, why can you never weigh up lives, or rather why you should not use a utilitarian metric to evaluate this debate? I think the important thing to note here is that the potential of every life is infinite, and therefore we cannot never know the individual utility of a person. Like, you don't know whether Dino will go on to find the cure for cancer at this point in time, because simply, like, the options are infinite. And also, the things that influence other things are unclear. So even if, like, I don't personally do this great big life thing, I might talk to somebody and inspire somebody to do that, which simply, like, in advance you can't know, but also in retrospect is incredibly hard to even find out. Therefore, we cannot assign a certain life a certain worth. But even if we could, we shouldn't, because the uniqueness of each single life and the full importance of that life to the person living it means that you can't do math with it, because it is so unique that you can't add up and subtract it from each other, because it is fundamentally uncomparable. Therefore, don't believe Op if they say, but killing Heydrich saved so many lives that it is legitimate to kill some other lives, which is likely what one of the Op teams will run. Cool. Why could you then reasonably predict that it's going to have bad outcomes? Look, if you live in a country that the Nazis took over, you're going to know that the SS is cruel, but you're also likely to have witnessed that cruelty yourself, especially if you're part of the resistance movement, because likely you already have done different resistance acts and like gotten the effects of that, either directly on the people who did it, being like shot or tortured for it, but also likely you've already seen revenge acts in other cases. Because, and this is the second thing, even if you had no idea that the SS are like bad and cruel people, the concept of revenge is very simple and very clear to understand. Thus, if I kill X important person, the people around that important person will want revenge for their death. What is a logical way to take revenge? Well, an eye for an eye. You kill someone I like, I kill someone you like. So therefore, civilian casualties are something that the people thinking of this Operation Anthropoid had to expect, and they knew fundamentally that innocence would suffer as a cause of this. Why then? Well, we think this is bad because at that point you actively take the step that leads to innocent suffering. So, even if you don't yourself pull the trigger, your actions have a direct line of effect to the death of a person, and we think that that is incredibly bad. Before I go on, I'll take closing.
When both action and inaction causes people to die, how is this then you choosing inaction, not also weighing on lives against each other?
So I think what Sia wants to get at here, that every inaction is obviously also an action. So if I choose to not save a drowning child, I also have a certain action there. However, I think that still, you can choose different actions to take. And choosing a specific action still has the full set of consequences in that they can't just say, at the moment that you don't kill Heydrich, you're responsible for all the people that die as the effect to him, because A, you could have done something different against him, but also B, even if you don't do anything against him, the moral responsibility still lies higher with a different person. Even if you believe this case from CO, I think it's still comparatively more morally illegitimate to actively doom somebody to death than to passively doom somebody to death. Cool. Thirdly then, let's talk about consent. Very important. Look, opposition side could be like, okay, but at the point that people consent into sacrificing their lives, it doesn't become morally illegitimate anymore. And you could be like, okay, presumably these people suffer a lot in the Nazi Union and they want Heydrich gone. Two reasons why this is very unlikely. Firstly, the proximity of harm to these people. So dying is the most grave and proximate harm you can have as a person, because your life just literally ends. I think that's pretty obvious. So at that point, even if you suffer under Nazi occupation, and even if you potentially know other people dying, you dying is still closer to you, and therefore a bigger harm, which is unlikely people actively want to engage in. Especially at the point that we're talking about a lot of different people, that even if 90% of them would consent into it, we just think that it's incredibly unlikely that everyone is going to take into it. I think secondly then, talking about direct self-interest and instincts, I think the fundamental instinct in every human being is to preserve their own life, for roughly the same reason I said before, because it's the thing that is the most important to you and that enables you to do anything else. At that point, that is something you want to preserve at all costs, and is something that you will instinctively always try to do. Actually, a third point I do have on this is that you can also consider who is even able to consent. If a 1-year-old child dies in this child could have never consented into sacrificing itself for the greater good or whatever. Therefore, fundamentally, it is just impossible for all these people to consent into the sacrifice. I think at that point, we just get to the situation that the outcome of this even being good is very unclear. Yes, you know that Heydrich is probably a bad person, but at the time, you were not able to even know the full scale. Even now, we can't directly link every single death to a certain person. Also, it's likely that they're going to send somebody worse after, so you can't know whether you're actually making any positive impact, but you do know that you're dooming innocents to suffer and die. Therefore, we beg you to propose.
Two very simple cases from OO. The reason why this is morally legitimate is 1, self-defense, and 2, the fact that these actors weren't acting rationally, they weren't sane, and therefore we can't hold them to standards of morality that we would hold rational and reasonable actors. I think moral legitimacy is much more than just this action is good or this action is bad, as OG says, right? Illegitimate and justified is this thing is morally unacceptable no matter what. It is a much higher bar to prove. You have to prove that this action at any point in history is something that we would never undertake, never justify. You would never be allowed to try and assassinate a leader of the worst and most evil movement ever at any point in history. And I think it doesn't necessarily also have to out in hindsight, which is why I think a lot of the OG case doesn't quite work. But moving on to the self-defense idea, right? So I think it's pretty common intuition that if you're being violated, you don't even have to be killed, but if you're being violated, then you have a right to defend yourself. And if your right to defend yourself sometimes leads in you committing violence against someone, possibly even killing that person, that is still a morally justified action that you can take, and that's why people get acquitted for it in court, right? But note that there was morally preferable, morally preferable courses of action that you could have chosen that isn't to commit violence against someone, but we still don't say that in court to people when they do use self-defense as their justification for what they did, right? You don't usually say to victims well, maybe you should have called everyone in the phone book first, which technically is a morally preferable outcome. You probably could have foreseen that you would have caused someone to suffer, and yet we still allow you to do this because of the scale of harm being done to you. And I think this is a very similar mechanism here, right? But the second reason is that moral legitimacy is just chronological. So I think we kind of get this idea, out of OG, that we don't really like utilitarian metrics, right? But it's just the fact that the people who were acting to kill Heydrich, right, just couldn't have known that like what their action was going to cause like mass brutality of their civilians, right? You can't act on knowledge that you don't have, and even if you can predict like something, that is still not the same as knowing that your action is going to cause like a massive amount of harm, right? This means that it's a much higher burden to prove that you can judge someone for a decision that they've made, like when they don't know the full outcome of what's going to be caused, right? So I think what we get from OG is that actually no, people have witnessed the cruelty of the Nazis, they've seen the scale of destruction that they have caused, and so like the people who did this knew that there would be like a massive like response from the SS and that innocent people would suffer. I think there's just two responses to this and why this obviously doesn't work. I think the first response is that this implies that the assassination team believes that the Nazis react in a way that is logical, right? So you think that your prediction is that the Nazis are only going to like backlash against us when we kill their leader, right? But I think that like that's probably just not true. You know, I think this is a group that has operated at maximum cruelty, that hasn't operated on like genuine moral guidelines or justification before. And so it's very unlikely that you see them as a rational actor who would respond in X, Y, Z. And so it's probably very unlikely that you can quantify how much harm is going to be caused to your community, right? The second thing is that you probably just believe that the scale of suffering cannot possibly get worse at the point of your action, right? Because two things. Either, if you don't intervene, you probably feel that just more people around you in your community are going to be brutalized and killed, in which case you not acting will lead to more people in your community suffering, right? Or the second reason is you probably think that people in your community are suffering so much that someone else will come in and try and assassinate Heydrich, but because they're not you are not sure of like whether or not they're going to succeed, in which case if you allow someone else that isn't you, who probably has the tech or has been planning this for a long time, seeing as they were successful, and it is kind of difficult to like assassinate leaders, right? You probably believe that another group could fail, and so the backlash against a failed like attempt at assassination is very likely to be even worse, because when you are successful in getting rid of a head of state, like the state is then weakened, there's a power vacuum, they're probably less likely to respond to you in a way. So I think there are both reasons why you probably don't know that innocent people are going to suffer, and that the self-defense mechanism probably still works. The second reason is that these people were not sane, and therefore we can't hold them to a justification that they were. So badness and like moral legitimacy and stuff is all arbitrary, right? Like people kill each other, like animals kill each other all the time. Therefore, morality is a human construct that we created so that we can live harmoniously together, right? We don't hold animals accountable for killing each other or even killing humans because we think it's irrational to hold them to a standard of reasonableness that they can't comprehend, not that we can comprehend, right? Therefore, for a person's action to be bad, they have to be able to comprehend the standard of reasonableness, and you can't do that when you're crazy. But you also can't do that when you're being made to act crazy by the environment that you're existing in, and I think that the 1940s is probably a good time in which everyone was kind of insane. I'll take you, closing.
This action was literally planned from the UK. People were not there, they were not personally facing the oppression. So
I think the scale of harm done by the Nazis in the 1940s is like quite known to the entire world, no matter like wherever like your group like is operating from, right? I think you probably have to prove that they would be completely insulated from the horrors, and I also like think it's unlikely. But if Cyrus thinks otherwise, he can respond. Okay, I think therefore that in this case, where you have had intense like emotions of seeing people be brutalized, you're aware of the scale of Nazi horrors, you're encountering like evilness on such an insane scale. I think one, you're probably just driven crazy by this like constant exposure to this, right? But the fact that like this guy, Heydrich, is like a leader of this. This person is a representation of the scale of evil in your community. He asserts it himself too, probably, because as leaders do, right? So it's also rational for you to probably not even perceive this person as a person in and of themselves, to just be like a version of the entire regime as itself. You're also probably just suffering from an insane amount of PTSD and lots of other bad things. And so, right. But then the third reason here is that you actually have a moral right to try and stop the evil, even if you fail, and even if you don't believe any of the other reasons of like self-defense and justification, right? An act is moral if everyone in the world can do that thing, and the world will continue to function. I think like opening government hasn't given you another standard of morality by which they judge actions. I think they just say utilitarianism is bad. I think this is a better metric of this, right? Killing is bad because if everyone were to go and kill someone, the world would not be able to function, right? But killing a Nazi leader is not bad because if everyone killed a Nazi leader, the world wouldn't cease to end. It would continue to function, and it would probably continue to function in a way that works better, right? The difference, though, is that what the Nazis were doing is not something that can be universalized. Like, if everyone did what the Nazis were doing, the world would also cease to function, in which case their actions is morally, illegitimate and can never be justified. Your actions can be justified, and therefore you have a moral legitimate right to try and stop that suffering. So unless OG can come up and, give you another, frame of morality, I think OO is winning this debate.
It is easy to cheer the death of a Nazi from the safety of being 80 years removed. It is easy to romanticize the sacrifice of the Czech people from today's point of view. Do not let opening opposition abuse this safety. Do not let them get away with claiming that harms were fine and everyone liked them because everyone agrees the Nazis are terrible. Instead, close your eyes. Imagine yourself as a random guy or girl in a Czech village. Say you're a school child, you're a teenager. You have never seen Heydrich in your life in person. You do not know what this person does to your life. You do not know what influence this person has on you. Your biggest concern is that you got a bad math grade. It is that whether you will marry your sweetheart at school. It is that for these people, it is not reasonable to assume that they will make the ultimate sacrifice of a painful, torturous death, or of living without parts of their families that have been killed by the SS retaliation. It is not, opposition does not have the right to assume that you are willing to do the sacrifice for a political goal. It is easy to romanticize the dead from the distance. It is not right. Opening opposition say you have this right because it is self-defense. Note that self-defense is always, by definition, by someone directly affected that makes this choice in the moment. I always have the choice when I am being attacked whether I want to defend myself or not. I do not have this choice if Alex is being attacked and they grab me and use me as a human shield. This is fundamentally what opposition are doing, right? I think we can say that this opposition then say that this is fine if everyone would agree it is good. They never prove to me that everyone agrees that it's good. This is an incredibly high burden, and if we can tell you that there is just one person that maybe likes the Nazis because they're of German descent and now got the farm of their neighbor, disagrees it's good, then apparently they have already not met their burden. I think it's a bit of a crazy metric, right? We probably shouldn't care whether the one Nazi collaborator in the village was happy about to take over, but anyway. Let me go up into why you cannot weigh up lives, why it is not true that your inaction is equal to your action, and some other scattered things, battle integrated. Why can you not weigh up lives? Let's take an action. We inject a person with a lethal poison. If we do this to a person that has terminal cancer and requested euthanasia, this is a morally neutral to probably even good act, right? If we do this to a person that is in the that is living their best life in good health, this is a terrible act and you probably go to prison. This shows to you that the same action is not morally equal. The same action of taking a life is not morally equal because not all lives are of equal value, because that value is subjective to the person that is having the life, right? If I don't care about my life anymore, it is probably of lower value to kill me than if I want to continue living. Therefore, we cannot access the value of this life because it is subjective. I cannot assess whether any of you want to be alive, therefore I should not be allowed to kill any of you, even if it gives someone a benefit, because I do not know whether you believe this benefit is worth your death. Opening opposition and say, but it is rational to put deliberation over your life. First of all, it is not for everyone, because not everyone is equally affected by Heydrich's presence. Not everyone has to share the same goals, and they have not so far given me any reason to believe that everyone believes that Heydrich is the worst thing in the world. Secondly, note that they don't actually end the Nazi occupation. They just change the person that is in charge of it in a way that we don't necessarily know whether it's actually better in the first place. But thirdly, people are irrational, and people are allowed to be irrational. People are doing stupid things like smoking, like spending a fuck ton of money to shout at strangers. People are really not always deciding rationally, and we cannot decide that they should die because it would have been rational for them to do so. This is a significantly higher burden than what they have met so far. POI, by the way?
You misunderstand. A moral act doesn't need to be popular. Not everyone needs to think that euthanasia is a good act. But if everyone who gets
The world continues to function if we sell you into slavery and split the money. If everyone in this room believes that this is a good thing, does that mean it would be moral to do that? I hope you don't agree with that. Otherwise, I guess I'm going to research some people. Let's talk about this POI we get from Victor, right? Victor tells us it is not morally neutral inaction is basically also an action, right? Fair point. However, I do not think it works in this case. Why? First of all, I believe that you have a reason that in order for your action to be morally morally better than inaction, I think you need to have an actual reasonable shot at this working out, and you cannot put other people in danger by doing a desperate attempt, right? This is why when you are doing a first aid course, people always tell you you should not run into a burning building to pull out people, because you will just put yourself at risk and probably not actually save any lives. I think this is the equivalent of running into a burning building for an uncertain benefit, right? Why is the benefit uncertain? First of all, at a point where you're planning the operation, you do not actually know whether you are succeeding at killing Heydrich. No thank you. Second of all, even if you succeed, you do not know whether it is actually beneficial for the people. Thirdly, even if you succeed and you remove the Nazi occupation by it, if a lot of people have died in the process, we don't necessarily know whether that was good, right? But otherwise, I think you just have a higher moral responsibility towards your own actions, because your own actions are something that you can choose and design to minimize harm, right? I cannot affect the behavior of the Nazis. Therefore, the Nazis killing people is not my moral failing. However, if I do something that prompts them to kill more people, and I can reasonably believe that they will do so for all the reasons we've given you, you have now directly killed more people. Do you think it's a graver harm than standing by when you were ultimately powerless to change it yourself in the first place? Finally, just a little bit of ahead of foreshadowing benchweighing against closing government's POI because of a bit of time. They tell you that this is something that has happened without the direct contact of the people. First of all, I think this is a great additional reason why you probably do not have the consent of those that are harmed by it, right? But note that if they want to analyze that this makes it somehow illegitimate because someone has decided for others, they will always rely on our analysis of why you need the consent of the harmed, why it is immoral to assume that someone will consent to being harmed for a greater good. We give you the reason why sacrifice needs to be personal, why sacrifice is not likely legitimate, is not likely to be agreed by everyone, and therefore illegitimate. Proud to be an OG.
Let's start with the burden push from opening government, because I think it's a little bit ridiculous here. As in, if they're trying to prove illegitimacy, we needn't prove its exact opposite. This is the most legitimate moral course of action. Only that it is not illegitimate. That's important because OG admits the subjectivity of morality, that there's no moral superiority of actions in an objective way in the first place, that it's back and forth. Therefore, if we're going to deem something illegitimate, that it has some sort of semblance of complete illegitimacy, not just moral inferiority, then you require some level of universality on their side and not ours. That means at some level, you need to be out with the subjectivity that inherently exists for whether an action is morally preferable. People have different considerations. I can call one action morally better in my own frame of moral reference, but to call something morally illegitimate requires a higher burden than that. For them to push the opposite burden just isn't how debating works in the first place. We are fine if they can eventually prove this was morally wrong, that there were other more moral courses of action that would have been preferable. We only claim that it was a morally legitimate action. Legitimacy can come from lots of sources. It doesn't require being morally superior in this way. Our burden is to prove moral justification, and that justification can be a subjective one. Of course, some justifications are. Let's talk about opening government then for a second. The first thing I want to talk is this idea that revenge is logical, that it makes sense given the cruelty that we've already experienced from the Nazis. I think Esme has already given this to some extent, but I think there isn't much response here. That is that already, when you've seen the Secret Service completely brutalize everyone around you and have an occupation that is fundamentally illogical, based on massive ideologies that are inherently irrational, then it doesn't make sense to ascribe rationality to this in the first place. As in, if you already think that they're doing all of this, if you see that they kill and torture for sport, and they don't require justification to do those things, it's unclear whether any more justification will change the level of this. In hindsight, it's easy to say it is not nearly as easy when it is actually happening. They are the ones who benefit from this hindsight vision. But importantly, even if you don't believe this is the most likely interpretation, we don't need that in the first place. As in, it's morally justified and morally illegitimate on their side only if you know for certain this would be the response. If instead there's only a possibility that they would react in such a strong way, even if it is the more likely possibility, it's understandable that maybe the people on our side didn't consider that to its eventuality or didn't actually have it, which again would impair the complete illegitimacy burden that they have. The next thing they talk about here is the idea that the people who eventually were harmed never consented in the first place. But I think neither did you in the first place. Their deaths are entirely the responsibility of the Secret Service and no one else. This makes sense. If I step out of line and swear something profane at a Nazi officer, and they think it was the person behind me and kill them, is that my responsibility? Unlikely. To go even one step further, if somehow me flicking a pen off this eventually leads through cause and effect to somebody else dying, that person is not my responsibility because I couldn't have foreseen exactly that consequence. Even if, with perfect logic and perfect rationality, I could have eventually figured out that chain of cause and effect, it is not an expectation for me to do so, and therefore we can't have illegitimacy. Okay, what then is the case that we bring you, and why is it so important? I want to start with this idea of reasonableness, because I think it's one that they miss, and then they ascribe a level of legitimacy that I just think is unfair in the first place. The idea here is that in the same way that an animal is not morally illegitimate for unnecessary cruelty, because we cannot ascribe our own human morality to the lion that brutalizes the gazelle unnecessarily, because it does not think as us, and we cannot understand it, then that isn't a morally illegitimate action. Similarly, we allow clinical insanity as a plea in trials because we understand that those people don't comprehend our version of morality and therefore cannot be bound by it. The principle here is that shared reason is a precursor for moral legitimacy in the first place. This operation, then, is an extension of this principle. That, sure, sitting here today in a unified Europe with material safety and luxury and freedom, we cannot ascribe our modern standard of morality on people who experienced what we can scarcely even comprehend in the first place. If human reason is this precursor, and we cannot possibly understand how these people were thinking, what they were going through, then it doesn't make sense to deem their actions morally illegitimate because of our own understanding 80 years later, as the DPM talks about. I am the one who is outraged in this case. So then why does the brutality impair your reason so much that we cannot now, in the modern day, deem it unreasonable? Because I'll point out to CG's point, these are Czechoslovak operatives. Obviously, they experience the harm themselves. I think it happens on 3 levels. First, it's the personal harm. The idea that your family and community might have been killed, brutalized, destroyed. We know that when you have such loyalty to these people, of course your reaction is incredibly insane, in the same way that a mother, when their child is killed, would do crazy, crazy things, and we wouldn't hold them morally illegitimate for doing so. But second is the scale. You're seeing cruelty of an intensity that is almost incomprehensible to you as a human individual. You don't understand how this could possibly happen, and you see it everywhere around you. It's not just your community, but it's the neighborhood next door, the city next to that one too. One man is the embodiment of all that cruelty in your eyes. The person who actually is the center of all of this hatred, all of this vitriolic type of things in the first place. He is exceptionally cruel. He is the embodiment of it. Of course then, if you can hardly even comprehend the scale of it in the first place, you'd eventually go against that person specifically. And then third is just the idea of war itself. As in, since the dawn of time, we've known that occupation and war makes men mad. You don't know peace. You don't know what that could look like. So therefore, your entire understanding of what is moral and what is not changes entirely. You're in a place where killing the enemy is just the normal, regular thing to do. So of course, your sense of morality changes here. The point here is that by our view of legitimacy, it is legitimate for these people because from their subjective understanding, this is just how it works. They don't have the reason that we do now to go for it.
Is it legitimate for you to create an AI that is going to destroy humanity, even though you are not the one who is going to do the killing, and it is the AI?
No, it would not be morally preferable for me to do so. But if I had absolutely no way of understanding that, or I didn't think that would eventually cause that type of action, it doesn't matter. As long as I individually did not have the ability to think that that would eventually happen, then I cannot be ascribed morally illegitimate for doing so. Maybe I shouldn't do it, but it doesn't actually go to legitimacy itself. That's the point we're making. These people have a different sense of morality than we do. The other point to make here is that from the perspective of them, it makes a lot of sense because of the extrapolation metric that Esme already gave you. That it makes sense that if everybody acted a little bit of this type of resistance, it would seem like a morally legitimate action. If we can show you that under this frame of moral reference, it makes sense to act in this way for specifically these types of people, then sure, maybe they're right. There were other more moral actions that could have been taken. This was a morally legitimate one because it seemed like it to them, and they are not here to tell you what was morally people they cannot understand and that no one sitting in this room can ever truly know. Vote opening opposition.